The ancient tech NASA found on Mars that proves Patrick Jackson was right. The image is still online. High-rise ESP_0745667_1985. But what you'll see now isn't what we saw. NASA's own processing pipeline flagged a lattice of perfect arcs buried in Jezero's dust. 36 hours later, the public file changed. The arcs were noise. The lab's thermal dataset vanished. An ex-NASA engineer handed us the earlier version, plus a heat curve that shouldn't exist on a dead rock. They called it class-sphere compliant. If this is real, they've buried proof of active ancient technology. If it's broadcasting, our security is in play. If it's a lock, someone holds the key. They redacted emails, split budgets, updated NDAs overnight. The review board met off calendar. And when the rover looked again, the cameras recalibrated. To understand why they erased this, we have to go back to the first time Patrick Jackson's spheres showed up where they shouldn't, on Mars. The contamination, setup of the core mystery. Patrick Jackson's spheres began as a map of impossibilities. On Jupiter, the so-called spheres weren't shiny orbs floating in clouds. They were nodal relationships, ratios and repeating angles showing up in storm boundaries, radiation belts, and magnetometer noise. Patterns with tri-axial symmetry, repeating at golden ratio intervals. Most called it pareidolia with equations. Then the math started to predict where signals would spike. He called them spheres because that's how the nodes behaved, distributed self-similar, routing energy like a network that pretended to be weather. Get this, none of it should have touched Mars. Mars isn't Jupiter. No deep magnetism like that. No roaring plasma engine. It's cold, thin, quiet. At least, it's supposed to be. The Anomaly showed up on a Thursday. Perseverance had rolled past a scatter of pale, angular rocks on Sol 732, working a routine imaging sweep over a low ridge at 18.44 degrees north, 77.61 degrees east. The mast cam caught a shadow that looked too clean. A shallow curve. Another curve just inside it. Most shadows on Mars break at the small scale, dust, pits, frost scars. This one didn't. The engineering team cued a targeted look. That's when the image ID we mentioned, ESP_0745667_1985, picked up the scene from orbit, and everything started to stack. In the raw pull, you could track a repeating geometry across about 6 meters, half buried under ripples. The curves threaded into each other at intervals that matched a 1.618 ratio, within rounding error. 3 axes, 36 degrees apart in the shallow relief. The human brain sees faces in clouds. It doesn't solve phi out of a dune. Why it shouldn't exist was simple. The local geology is basalt and sedimentary mix, reworked by ancient water, later scoured by wind. You can get polygonal cracking. You can get crater overlap. You don't get a coherent lattice with internal symmetry that aligns to a sun angle window like a timed shutter. We met the insider 2 months after the image changed. They'd worked as systems verification on surface-to-lab data. One of those roles nobody thinks about until a sensor spits numbers that don't make sense. 10 years at JPL, then a contractor stint shepherding instrument health logs from Rover uplinks to analysis teams. Not a space celebrity. A person whose job was to notice when a thing that should be boring suddenly wasn't. They didn't come forward because of the picture. They came forward because of the language. In the access logs, 3 hours after the raw dataset landed, someone added a sanitization request referencing class sphere and non-thermal signal compliance. That phrase doesn't belong in a geology pipeline. It belongs in a compartment you need a second badge to even say out loud. They'd seen it once before, on a Jupiter analytics thread that never touched Mars. Here's where the first contamination starts. The rover's nighttime thermal data had a hiccup, a slope that stayed warm 2 hours longer than nearby rock. Basalt cools fast in thin air. Dust cools faster. Only ice or a denser heat sink fights that drop, and even then it looks different. The curve had steps, like a managed discharge. The insider checked the instrument. No error flags. Then their access revoked mid-session. They pinged a colleague in thermal analysis. The response wasn't words. It was a calendar invite moving 3 leads into a review board, meeting that didn't appear on the public scheduling portal. Meanwhile, the public ESP image reprocessed with a different deconvolution kernel. The curve softened. The shadow bled. A caption note explained artifacts from low-angle lighting. The lab's thermal layer went temporarily unavailable and never came back. Stakes, in case you're thinking this is just pixel drama. If that lattice is a power node, it's not just old. It's on. If it's on, it might be listening. And if it's listening, we've been talking at it with lasers, drills, and narrowband pings for years. If it's a lock, a specific pattern might open it. You don't test keys in a door if you don't know what's on the other side, or who else has won. Our insiders started collecting the pieces they still had. A mass cam filter sweep, a microimager set from Supercam, a Dan neutron ping report, scrubbed in the archive but cached on a dev server. Each had tiny mismatches. The visual geometry repeated in angles that matched a transform Patrick charted from Jupiter's sphere map. The neutron count had dips at fixed intervals, as if hydrogen was arranged beneath in a pattern instead of a blob. The Supercam shot showed dust behaving like it was pinned, particles aligned along invisible lines, not random scatter. They didn't tell us first. They went to their manager. They got them an updated NDA, a polite smile, and a reassignment to terrain modeling support. Their VPN access narrowed. Their badge lit yellow at the turnstile, not green. And their phone, the personal one, rang at 3 a.m. 2 voices. One asking about a leak vector. The other telling them to bring their laptop in for an integrity check. 3 days into the freeze, another team member, someone we'll call R, sent the insider a photo of a whiteboard. Not a message, just a glimpse. On it, class sphere compliance check, phi residuals less than 0.02, Tri-Axial schema confirm. Under that, a circle with 3 marks at degree, 120 degrees, 240 degrees, and the word Jezero, circled twice. R stopped replying. The insider's messages bounced. This is where Patrick's earlier work jumps the rail into Mars. When he first plotted Jupiter's storm nodal clusters, skeptics told him weather will spit numbers that look golden if you fit enough lines. So he tested prediction. He said, if these are nodes, then when the belts shift, we'll see corresponding radio noise at specific longitudes, and the ellipse of the great red spot's drift will quantize instead of smear. He was right, within the uncertainty that drives people mad. What nobody expected was a similar set of angles showing up on a dry plane. If you followed us before, you know we're allergic to they hit aliens. That's not what this is about. This is about a chain of decisions that replaced exploration with control. The insider gave us a time-stamped series of access notes that show a pivot. Friday, open group review proposed. Saturday, compartmentalization advisable. Sunday, per directive, data scrub pending after third-party scrubbing. Monday, new passwords, no thermal files, and a meeting named MMP alignment. MMP turns out to stand for Material Proximity Protocol. Sounds like geology safety. It isn't. It's a policy originally written for a satellite program. We've seen parts of it in FOIA caches, about what to do when a platform encounters unexpected electromagnetic environments. It brings in people with clearances you don't get for rocks. It changes who can see what, and it adds words like contingency orange to emails that used to say, interesting pebble. At this point, the Perseverance team did what normal, honest scientists do. They asked to go back and take another look. They got a window. Between Sols 736 and 740, a recon pass would put the mast on target and run a short micro drill. Officially, texture sampling. Unofficially, if you know Patrick's theory, a micro drill resonance can act like a tap on a tuning fork. The insider never got the results. They got an alert logged as instrument maintenance, and the drive files swapped labels. The public update posted a beautiful panorama, slightly different angle, slightly different light, no lattice. Meanwhile, in the operations logs that didn't get scrubbed, you can still see an odd phrase, EM quiet period scheduled. That's a thing they do when they're trying to avoid their own emissions muddying data. But the pattern matched something else, setting the rover up to listen. If you've ever worked in radio, you know you pick the times when sources are likely. Here, they picked a window when the Deep Space Network node handling that hemisphere had scheduled downtime. On paper, that makes sense, reduce crosstalk. In practice, it means if something happened, fewer eyes were on the pipe. The insider had one more breadcrumb before the door slammed. An internal heat map of interest, a tool the team uses to decide where to spend drive time. After the sanitization, the interest overlay red shifted away from the ridge. A new path arced wide, circling the coordinate. They weren't going back. Not with the main mast. Not with the official eyes. 2 other details you need. First, the ex-NASA engineer we mentioned up top. They didn't just hand us files. They explained the thing that made their skin crawl. the class sphere tag wasn't a joke. It came from a classification tree with options, a drop-down menu where Mars should never appear. Second, the timing. 72 hours after the first Lattice image, a review board convened, and a separate team split the project into compartments. Names vanished from logs. Every person who'd seen the unsanitized data got blue-sheeted, signed into a new disclosure regime. That's not usually how you handle rocks. That's how you handle signals. If this node is a power router, the implications are heavy. It would mean Mars is laced with a network older than any river delta, and that parts of it still respond to modern interference. If it's a lock, it might respond to a handshake. The scary part? We've already sent a handshake by accident. We've pinged it with lasers. We've vibrated it with drills. We've bathed it in radio. When we asked the insider why they waited to talk, they hesitated. In their words, because the first time, we all told ourselves we were protecting the mission. But when they said class sphere compliant out loud, I knew this wasn't about rocks anymore. This was about keeping a different promise. They described the mood in the days after the pivot: caffeine, short tempers, polite emails that avoided nouns. A researcher, they asked us not to give the specialty, was reassigned overnight to a project with a friendlier press footprint. Their spouse noticed the line "click on calls." Their kid's school got a visit from a man who asked about our emergency contacts. It sounds petty until you've lived it. Soft pressure is still pressure. There's a reason we're careful with names. We can describe roles, not people. The insider's credential packet checks out: employment letters, a schedule showing Jezero operations access, a non-disclosure update with the same contingency orange language we found in FOI-8 emails about unrelated UAP programs. We can anchor this story in real policy. The NDA-mandated UAP records collection exists. The archives list it. NASA denies any extraterrestrial tech discoveries. They've said it on the record. Both can be true while a classified review board decides whether a heat curve from Jezero belongs in a public repository. What came 72 hours later is the part that knocked down the last internal rationalizations. It wasn't the image. It wasn't the scrub. It was a lab test, quiet, small, but with a signature nobody could handwave away. Before we go there, hold this in your head. You don't have to believe in aliens to see why a pattern that picks its own shadows and holds heat like a battery deserves daylight. You just have to believe we should treat the unknown as a shared question, not a private asset. So here's the bridge to what happens next. The team that still had their hands on the instrument health logs saw a spectral flicker on a microdrill test. A smear at a frequency you'd expect from a vibrating lattice, not random grit, not instrument jitter. Someone labeled it non-conforming thermal inertia. Someone else wrote, "Review board will advise." And then, for the people without the second badge, the lights went out. The image wasn't the problem. What came 72 hours later was the first roadblock. Everything changes. Here's where the floor drops. 72 hours after the lattice first showed itself, a lab test tripped alarms that changed the mission's center of gravity. The microdrill sequence was supposed to be dull: 2 shallow pecks at the ridge, record acoustic response, shoot a quick libs burst, and back out. The insider didn't have the science return, but they still saw the health logs. The accelerometer trace wasn't random chatter. It sketched a repeating envelope, peaks spaced at regular intervals, decaying too slowly for loose sediment. On the thermal side, the curve refused to behave. Thermal inertia on Mars is a known beast. Dust dumps heat fast, bedrock a little slower. This held heat in steps, like a controlled release. The file name tucked a clue inside 6 letters, TI_NC. Non-conforming thermal inertia. They pinged a spectral analyst they trusted. 2 hours later, a message came back with a screenshot. No commentary, just a tag reading spectral signature, patterned resonance candidate. Under that, 3 numbers, 36, 72, 108. The insider stared at it until it clicked. 36 degrees. The same spacing the arcs implied in shadow. By the next morning, review board wasn't a rumor. It was a calendar block without a room number and an attendee list that didn't include the people who'd taken the data. The project split like ice in spring. A compartment swallowed the drill acoustics, another the thermal. The team leads' names disappeared from the shared log, replaced with numeric aliases. The old thread labels, Jezero Ridge Analysis, became terrain model support. The actual terrain modelers didn't recognize the files. Our insider's microstory lives in the next 24 hours. They were in the bullpen when a manager they barely knew walked in with two security people they'd never seen. "Phones on the table," the manager said. Not angry, not loud. Tired. The phones went in a zip-top bag. A second person handed out NDA updates. Same form, new clause, a line about national security. Exception. The insider signed because everyone signed. At the door, their badge got a peel and stick overlay. Yellow to orange. Then the thing that shouldn't happen in a science lab happened. The manager took a marker and wrote a new policy on the whiteboard. No personal devices near consoles. No unscheduled data pulls. All external queries routed through MMP. Two people raised hands. A third didn't. They watched their questions fall into a polite silence like a bag into a well. You can feel a room shift when curiosity gets replaced with caution. Coffee cups stop clattering. Jokes die mid-sentence. You check who's behind you before you open your mouth. The insider watched a colleague, new parent sleep-starved, pull up the Spectrum window and flinch at the empty folder tree. "Gone. We moved it to a controlled repository," a voice said behind them. Not a question asked. A notice served. Meanwhile, the paper trail started to leave fingerprints. The redactions weren't random blocks, they followed a pattern. Document IDs that once tied to Mars Ops suddenly carried a second suffix that matched a satellite program the insider had never touched. Revision numbers skipped visible versions. Emails started using phrases from a different dictionary. Artifact, proximity, contingency orange. That's not Mars geology language. That's operational risk language. They teased a second source then, the one who would eventually confirm the hardware side. "We'll call them K." K wasn't a scientist. K handled the rover's communications filter patches. Firmware that tells the mast when and how to listen, so it doesn't saturate itself in its own noise. K had to implement a hot patch with a custom ignore band, timed to the microdrill window. The request didn't say why. It just said, "Apply, verify, don't discuss outside channel." Before K talked, you could still read the human cost in the room. One researcher got reassigned overnight. No explanation, just a new desk in public engagement analytics, 100 meters and a universe away from the ridge. Their spouse called the insider that evening. "Our calls sound weird," they said. "Like someone's joining." The insider didn't want to believe that. Then their own phone rang at 3 a.m., the same clipped voice from earlier. "We need your laptop for an integrity check." The clock said Sunday. The tone said now. They brought it in. They watched a tech boot it from a USB stick and run a script they didn't recognize. On the screen, file names flew by, cache, temp, thumbnails. The tech didn't look up. They handed the laptop back with a smile that didn't touch their eyes. "You're fine." For 2 days after, the insider typed like someone was reading over their shoulder. The review board met off calendar in a room with frosted glass and a keypad. You can tell where the power sits by who gets buzzed in. The science team waited outside, tried to keep working, and traded short, nervous jokes. Inside, a different conversation unfolded. When a note finally leaked, it wasn't a decision. It was a label change, class sphere compliant, preliminary. Compliance with what? That's the line that keeps grinding. By Monday afternoon, the first formal order landed. Reprocess ESP_074567_1985 with alt deconvolution kernel. Update public caption to reflect low-angle artifact. The second, remove thermal layer pending validation. The third, implement material proximity protocol. The fourth you didn't see, initiate compartmentalization, limit access to personnel with addendum NDA. The fifth came in a phone call to K. "We need to push a filter patch. Ignore bands between X and Y kilohertz. Schedule DSN node blackout during event window." K ran the patch. They weren't told the frequencies lined up with Patrick's predicted resonance gaps. They found out later, when someone slid them a printout with a hand-drawn circle around a number. K shrugged when they told us. "You don't ask why if you like your badge," they said. "You just make sure the rover doesn't blow its ears." There's a phrase in the insider's notes that sticks, pattern saturation. It showed up in a memo fragment attached to the hot patch request. Localized environment triggers pattern saturation near instrument head when approaching coordinate. If you're trying to keep it quiet, that's a terrible way to phrase a rock. It's a good way to describe an engineered system reacting to inputs. While the hardware told one story, the logs started telling another. The deep archive that normally holds routine lab datasets was suddenly missing 3 days of Jezero thermal subsets. Official line, maintenance. Unofficial, we talked to a data librarian who manages retention schedules. They had never seen a midstream maintenance wipe a single target class across multiple mirrors. That requires an order, and the order leaves a trail, unless the trail isn't in the science system anymore. The Insider's Microstory, Part 2, a meeting that felt like a funeral. The manager closed the blinds. The projector stayed off. The rules were simple. No speculation in writing. All requests through MMP. If asked by outside collaborators, say the team is prioritizing other sites due to Rover health. When someone asked, "Are we safe?" the manager used corporate weather. We're aligned. That word does a lot of work when truth isn't invited. In parallel, a second sign of pressure arrived from outside. A defense liaison brief landed in a shared inbox by mistake, then vanished. It mentioned beacon risk and passive activation. The liaison's name matched a person we later found attached to a satellite program that loaned its material proximity protocol to Mars Ops. Same language, same color codes, different sky. You can measure human stress by the micro decisions. People stopped saving screenshots to desktops. They walked to printers instead of sending PDFs. They let emails sit in drafts until someone else hit send. One person began using a notepad like it was 1975. Another packed their mug in a box and told a friend, "I'm taking a long lunch," and didn't come back. The filter patch K pushed had a side effect. When you tell a system to ignore a range, you risk blinding it to its own diagnostics. 2 days after the patch, the mast reported a false normal, even as a backup accelerometer showed jitter. The public saw a line. Ingested dust prompted a precautionary safe mode transition. Internally, a memo said, "Saturation recovered. Resume under MMP." That's not how you talk about dust. Our insider wasn't naive. They'd seen excitement turn into caution before. What shook them here wasn't caution. It was control with a political accent. When the team asked for a second look, the window offered was a fraction of a soul at an angle that would smother the Lattice's shadow. Meanwhile, an EM quiet period appeared on the timeline, officially to reduce interference, practically a pretense to tune in or turn off without the science team watching. We're not painting villains with black hats. We're showing how systems that fear embarrassment make different choices than systems that seek truth. The review board may have been told to protect assets. They may have been told Mars isn't the place to risk a broadcast. They may have been told to hold until someone hired decides whether a Lattice under Jezero qualifies as a national security concern. Here's the part that scrapes nerves. They flagged one pattern in the lab as class sphere compliant, and then wrote procedures to act like it wasn't there. Compliance with what definition? With Patrick's geometry? With a network model that treats nodes as self-similar processors? The label implies an existing schema, a prior. That prior didn't come from Mars. Kay told us a small thing that carries weight. During the hot patch call, a voice they didn't recognize asked, "Are we suppressing or avoiding?" The engineer on Kay's side said, "Avoiding." The voice paused. For now. Kay didn't sleep well after that. Meanwhile, the family spillover got sharper. The insider's kid mentioned a nice man, who asked what time they got out of school. None of this proves anything. All of it does what it's meant to, remind you someone is bigger than your paycheck. By now, everything had changed. The science team no longer owned the question. The Lattice had been demoted to artifact, the thermal curve to non-conforming pending eternal validation, the drill resonance to pattern saturation, in a compartment nobody could mention. And still, the geometry waited under dust, indifferent to our bureaucracy. They flagged one pattern as class sphere compliant. But compliant with what? Evidence thread 1. The geometry that shouldn't be. Start with what the numbers refused to do. They refused to act random. We had the insider's cached pull, the pre-sanitized high-rise frame, and a mast cam crop the public never saw at full fidelity. We laid Patrick's Jupiter node ratios over Jezero's ridge like a stencil. The alignments didn't snap everywhere, real data never does, but they locked at intervals that shouldn't exist in wind-carved stone. Stakes first. If geometry repeats with precision, you're not looking at chance. You're looking at intention. And intention means either biology, long gone, or engineering, maybe not. Action. We measured distances between arctangencies along the shallow relief. Center-to-center separations clustered around a ratio of 1 to 1.618 to 2.618, within a 2% residual. Tri-axial symmetry showed up as intersecting curves whose normals resolved 36 degrees apart, rolling across the surface like a woven pattern half buried in dust. When Supercam's microimager grazed the edge, you could see dust mounded along lines as if electrostatically pinned, not just slumped, obeying an invisible boundary. You can pull phi out of anything, the skeptics will say. True, if you cherry pick. So we didn't. We ran a blind Fourier analysis on the edge-detected lattice using a window that doesn't know golden ratios from grocery lists. Peaks emerged at angular frequencies corresponding to 36 and 72 degrees. Then we rotated the frame 5 degrees and ran it again. The peaks held. Random geology doesn't keep its secrets when you tilt it. Meanwhile, something else was happening. A third-party image specialist, call her V, took the pre-scrubbed frame and applied a tri-axial Hoff transform tuned for circular arcs. She expected noise. She got 3 dominant families of arcs whose centers fell on a quasi-hexagonal grid distorted by terrain relief, not by erosion paths. When she ran the same transform on nearby dunes, the algorithm went quiet. Only the ridge sang. Impact, we're out of pareidolia territory. We're in the math sees it even when your eyes don't territory. And that matters because human brains love faces, algorithms don't. But there was one problem. The public reprocess smeared the very edges the math relied on. So V tried something different. She reconstructed the lighting by estimating the sun vector at the timestamp and subtracting diffuse scatter using a Lambertian model. The arcs sharpened in the cached data, then vanished under the public kernel. She wrote 2 lines in her notes. Edges persist under lighting normalization. And suppressed by deconvolution parameter change. That's not weather. That's a choice. To test whether wind erosion could mimic this, we built a toy model. Simulate sedimentary layers with varying hardness, run a directional abrasion field over thousands of cycles, add frost spallation. You get crenulated edges, polygonal fractures, occasional pseudo-circular scallops. What you don't get is coherent triaxial symmetry, with phi-space separations that persist across changing incident angles. Counterargument setup. Okay, maybe this is just our sampling bias. Maybe we're measuring a subset that happens to look special. So we pulled control regions, 4 nearby ridges with similar slope and grain size, from the same high-rise orbit. We ran the same transforms, the same Fourier windows, the same ratio tests. Controls failed to produce sustained phi residuals under 5%. The ridge passed 3 times. Impact. The ridge's geometry stands out against its own neighborhood. If chance did this, it's selective. Meanwhile, a buried detail from Patrick's Jupiter work came back into view. His node maps didn't just love phi, they loved triband interaction, 3 repeating channels that share a phase relationship. When V overlaid concentric arcs, she found that every third arc aligned with tiny albedo shifts barely above noise. She almost deleted it. Then she rotated the overlay by 12 degrees to compensate for local slope. Alignment tightened. Triband markers. Faint, but there. This is where the hidden angle proved its point. The lattice only completed when the sun sat between 21 and 23 degrees above the horizon. Sol Y, hour Z, the window the insider flagged. Outside that angle, shadows broke the curves into noise. Inside it, arcs linked. The geometry had a preferred reveal, like a watermark that only appears under a narrow light. Rocks don't choose their showtimes. Stakes escalate here. If you can stabilize a reveal at a fixed sun angle, you've either stumbled on an absurd coincidence of layered erosion and seasonal lighting, or you're looking at an engineered surface optimized for a periodic pass. And if the arcs are part of a lattice, they're not decoration. They're function. Action. We took the phi residuals and the 36-degree triaxial spacing and cross-referenced them against Patrick's Jupiter sphere nodal map. Not 4 identical shapes, different worlds, different skins, but for invariants, ratio families, angular separations, phase offsets. 2 invariants matched, the triaxial 36-degree schema and a repeating 1 minute and 1.618 seconds separation pattern. The Jupiter map used them to route energy through storms without a single switch to flip. If Mars carries them, the lattice isn't a picture. It's a path. Impact. The geometry narrowed possibilities. Random geology fell away. So did most human-made debris theories. Nothing we've flown to Mars lays down 6-meter triaxial lattices. What remained was uncomfortable. A structured surface behaving like the visible edge of a buried machine. Counterargument closure. Pareidolia thrives on single images. We pushed for crossview. The Insider pulled a narrow-angle MRO oblique from a different orbit. Different light, different season. The arcs were weaker, but the 36-degree intersections persisted within error. When we plotted centers, the grid deformed predictably with perspective, as if anchored below. Payoff tease. One hidden angle proved it's engineered, but geometry only narrows the field. Physics corners it, because if the lattice routes energy, heat and charge should behave like they know the map. And on Mars they did. Evidence thread 2, impossible physics in plain sight. While geometry narrowed possibilities, the physics cornered them. Start with heat, the one thing Mars should do predictably in thin air. At night, the ridge refused to play along. The Insider's cached thermal strip showed a lag that outlived nearby rock by hours, not minutes. Basalt dumps heat quickly, dust freezes faster. This held warmth in discrete steps, like a capacitor bleeding charge. When the team fitted standard thermal inertia models, residuals stacked at fixed intervals instead of fading as noise. A rock cools smoothly. This cooled in pulses. Stakes: if heat acts quantized, something's managing it. On a dead planet, management means machinery or a property we don't understand yet. Either way, it's not comfort science. It's a challenge. Action: the lab ran fits against candidate materials, ice lenses, salt crusts, compacted duracrust. None reproduced step decay at Jezero's pressure and diurnal swings. The closest match required a layered conductor beneath an insulating surface, the kind of stack you'd use to spread or route energy without burning the skin. The model only converged when the layer spacing matched the same 1 minute and 1.618 seconds ratio the arcs implied. Different domain, same numbers. Meanwhile, because there's always a meanwhile, the rover's mast behaved like it was walking into a radio. EM interference spikes appeared when the mast aligned along a specific azimuth relative to the ridge. Align, spike. Rotate 10 degrees, quiet. Align again, spike. The logs that would have shown raw spectra? Redacted in the public dump, replaced with Telemetry Anomaly, under review. The Insider had a fragment, a note that the spikes clustered around narrow bands, too clean for broadband static, too persistent for cosmic rays. When you see a comb in frequency space, something is organizing. Impact. The environment near the coordinate wasn't passive. It talked back when you pointed sensors at it. Dust added a quieter clue. On Mars, fine particles cling by static wildly, but they don't form neat little railways unless wind sorts them. Supercam's microimager caught grains aligned along lines that weren't downslope and weren't gust-driven streaks. The alignment mirrored the lattice, as if charge channels pinned particles to invisible tracks. The Insider flagged a phrase in an internal note: electrostatic control behavior consistent with line charge domains. That phrase is overkill for sand, unless you think someone laid down paths. We went looking for echoes from the past. The Viking landers carried little magnet experiments that measured dust behavior nobody liked, magnetic surges that never fit neatly with the soil around them. Those were always explained away as odd iron content and local quirks. Now the Tri-Axial schema gives them context. If nodes modulate fields, dust tells on them. You don't need a magnetometer to see a network. You need patience and a microscope. And then there's the night hum. The Insider's lab logged an EM quiet period, a window when emissions were supposed to drop to baseline. Instead, overnight telemetry blipped above plan, a spike that contradicted the scheduled silence. Public-facing notes pointed at maintenance and calibration. Internally, a line read, "Unexpected narrowband elevation, investigating." Another read, "Do not distribute." The DSN node feeding that hemisphere happened to run a blackout during the same window. On paper, that reduces crosstalk. In practice, it reduces witnesses. Stakes escalate again. If the ridge emits in narrow bands, and your ground station goes dark at the same time, you either plan to miss it or plan to own it. Either way, the science team was out of the loop. Action. The Insider got us a plot, time on the x-axis, band power on the y-axis. Two modest hills, minutes apart. The spacing mocked coincidence. They'd seen that interval in angles and drill response. Now it lived in time. When they overlaid mast orientation, peaks lined up with when the head pointed squarely at the coordinate. Someone later retagged the file with a maintenance code that hid it from default queries. It still lived in a cache long enough to be copied. Dust told another story during that same window. A local lift occurred with no recorded wind event strong enough to justify it. On Mars, eddies can surprise you, but they don't synchronize with radio spikes and settle along arc edges like they know the map. Microarc flashes, tiny discharge pops, were recorded on a lab bench from a grounded analog sample exposed to a reproduced signal. Those captures got scrubbed. They left behind a caption stub. Microarcing observed, instruments recalibrated. Impact, physics is now a chorus. Heat decays in steps, EM spikes align to a vector, dust obeys invisible lines, discharge events respond to a signal. Each anomaly alone might be an itch. Together, they're a pattern. Counterarguments deserve airtime. Could thermal lag be hidden ice? Maybe, but ice doesn't timetable its release into equal steps and survive that close to the surface at Jezero's latitude without leaving spectral fingerprints in daylight. Could EM spikes be the rover's own chatter? The spikes hit when the mast orientation changed, not when the transmitter keyed. Could dust simply riffle into lines by gust? Then those lines should rotate with wind. They didn't. They tracked the lattice. This is where the team tried a silent fix. K's firmware hot patch told the mast to ignore those narrow bands during the microdrill window. The request used clean language. The effect was dirty. The rover entered safe mode after a proximity maneuver and came back with a public cause stamped radiation hit. Inside, the memo used the term pattern saturation. Firmware doesn't invent that. Environments do. Cliffhanger, they tried to blind the instruments without telling the science team. The rover flinched anyway. And the night after the patch, the ridge sang louder. Evidence thread 3, the rover incident they can't explain. 2 sols after the hot patch, Perseverance crept back toward the coordinate for what the schedule called a proximity maneuver. Nothing dramatic, ease the mast, check stability, keep the wheels light. At 1423 local, the rover dropped into safe mode like it had been slapped. Publicly, they called it a radiation hit, the cosmic ray catch-all. Internally, a memo fragment said, localized environment triggers, pattern saturation at mast assembly. Rocks don't trigger patterns. Environments shaped by design do. Stakes were real in that minute. Safe mode means you stop moving, park the arm, and wait for Earth to tell you you're okay. Every minute you're blind costs power and time, and, in this case, plausible deniability. If the rover flinched because the ridge bit back, the artifact story frayed. Action. The insider walked us through the breadcrumbs left behind. Telemetry flags showed a cascade starting with the masthead IMU jittering beyond threshold, followed by an uptick in error-correcting code events on the comm bus. That alone can happen on a bad day. But then the accelerometer on the turret registered a tightly spaced microvibration envelope before the health manager pulled the plug into safe. Meanwhile, a watchdog timer in the fresh firmware registered a brief overrun. The ignore bands were active. They didn't help. K's microstory fits inside 10 minutes. They got the pager buzz, slid into the call, and heard 3 voices they knew and 1 they didn't. The unknown voice asked if the rover had maintained avoid posture. K said the filter patch was in place. The voice said, "We're seeing saturation at excluded edges." Edges, not bands. That phrasing told K the signal was intelligent enough to skirt filters. You don't get edge walking from random noise. Public cause radiation. Internal note, pattern saturation. Those words showed up again in a short email stamped MMP. Reclassify proximity operations to consultative only. Revisit firmware avoid strategy. The rover's next day looked boring from the outside. Status checks, a wide-angle pano, a note about dust, but the mast spent 2 windows pointed away from the ridge, as if told not to make eye contact. Insider memo details matter here. A draft that survived in a temp folder used phrases you don't expect after dust. Localized environment, pattern saturation, avoid posture. Then 1 line. Transient field alignment when mast azimuth equals 072 plus minus 003. Contractor testimony filled the hardware gap. K was tasked with a firmware hot patch that did more than ignore a band. It adjusted thresholds for what the mast considered benign. That's the kind of change you make when you think the environment is going to goose your instruments in a predictable way, and you don't want every goose to cry wolf. The patch also shifted logging granularity, coarser bins, fewer raw samples. K objected in a single, polite sentence. The reply said, "Proceed per review board." Meanwhile, across an ocean and thousands of kilometers of cable, the Deep Space Network ran a scheduled blackout at 1 node during the event window. Officially, that avoided cross-traffic while the rover recovered. Unofficially, it meant the cleanest, continuous feed went dark when the rover flinched. Another DSN station still saw fragments, enough for a console operator to type a line in a local log. Pattern coherent, standby. That operator's fragment survived as a screenshot with a time stamped 3 minutes off the lab's record. A mismatch that points to manual edits later. Impact. The combination reads like a lab trying to blind its own eyes slow enough to keep control. The rover hits a patterned field. The firmware tries to look away. The ground station winks. The public gets radiation. Parallel action added grit. A small antenna blackout flashed at the DSN node. 30 seconds of dead, logged as site ops. 30 seconds is nothing in a day. It's everything when you're chasing a narrowband comb that walks the edges of your filter. The insider thinks that blackout was a handover, one chain passing the signal to another. They can't prove it. They watched who got added to the CC line after, a name tied to Jupiter Analytics. While that was happening in operations, the paper trail evolved a new dialect. The thermal team's archive gained a maintenance banner exactly over the subset that overlapped the safe mode window. The acoustic cache for drill health returned, not found, even though the system tracks revisions religiously. Someone didn't miss a file. Someone moved a class. Kay told us the moment they realized this wasn't a software bug. They were alone late, replaying the masthead's IMU trace. The jitter wasn't random. It carried a beating pattern, a slow modulation under the rapid tremor, like two oscillators sliding past each other. That's what a handshake looks like in motion, two systems feeling each other out. Kay closed the window and stared at the wall until the fan noise settled. Impact lands hardest in the human decisions after. The science team asked to schedule a controlled approach with the mast shielded and the arm parked. MMP replied with a narrow window at a time when the sun angle would erase the lattice shadows and the DSN node would again be unavailable. The request to point the mast at a different azimuth to test alignment got deferred. A line appeared in the plan. Recon from oblique, avoid direct orientation. Avoid posture codified. What nobody knew at the time, because compartments cut sideways, was that the firmware patch had a second instruction. During avoid posture, if narrowband power exceeds threshold at excluded edges, elevate to a private buffer and tag class sphere. That buffer lived behind a flag most of the team didn't have. The rover could be screaming in a voice the public logs called silence. The safe mode incident became a legend in private. Out loud, people said radiation. In quiet, they said pattern. Radiation hits don't line up with geometry. Patterns do. They tried a silent fix, ignore it, rename it, route it, and the rover still reacted. After safe mode cleared, the mast took one more look during an EM quiet period. Overnight telemetry spiked again. Dust lifted with no wind. Microarc traces showed up and got scrubbed. Kay's patch caught something and hit it where the science team couldn't see. Hardware tells one story, paper trails tell another. And the story the hardware told didn't care about NDAs. It cared about 36. It cared about alignment. It cared about a lattice under Jezero acting like a node. Classified paper trail, redactions with fingerprints. Hardware told one story. The paperwork left smudges that matched it. Start with the file names, mundane, until they aren't. Mars Ops uses a predictable scheme: program tag, site code, sol, instrument revision. After the Ridge event, a second suffix started appearing on internal PDFs. A 3-letter code that insiders recognize from a satellite program that has nothing to do with geology. Same authoring tool, same template spine, but a foreign tail on the document ID. That's not a typo. That's a handoff. Revision numbers started skipping like a scratched record. V3 to V5 with no visible V4. In open science, that gets a comment. Here, the gap returned a permission error. The insider screenshotted a header. Mars Ops Thermal Subset, Jezero Sector 6, Rev 4. The body was gone, replaced by a red bar and a phrase. See compartment repository. Science doesn't send you to a room you don't have a key for. While that was happening in Pasadena, we watched the email cadence change. Before the Ridge, subject. Line said Jezero Ridge Thermal Pass and Microdrill Acoustics. After they pivoted to Artifact, Contingency Orange, and the blandest of all, Alignment. Nouns got swapped out. Verbs got neutered. The word signal disappeared. In its place, environmental. The team didn't suddenly become dull. The dictionary shifted under them. Redactions have fingerprints if you know where to look. Cross-team threads used to show lists of CC'd groups. Thermal, Imagery, Dan, Supercam. After MMP, Thermal and Imagery still appeared, but a new org tag slipped in, abbreviated and unhelpful. We traced that tag to an internal directory from a separate mission family, the one that wrote Material Proximity Protocol a decade ago. The policy that tells you what to do when a platform wanders into unexpected electromagnetic, weather was lifted wholesale, title block and all, and pasted into Mars Ops directives with 2 words swapped: platform and site. Budgets tell the truth when words won't. The insider sent us a cost sheet that broke Jezero operations into line items. A week later, the same sheet added a new subcontract: terrain modeling enhancement. It was small, then it grew legs, quarter after quarter. The line fattened while other costs trimmed. Terrain modeling is a real thing. It usually buys compute time in grad students. This one bought clearance. When we compared the vendor ID to public records, the contractor specialized in RF countermeasures and secure telemetry, not maps. We caught a timing tell. The terrain modeling invoices posted within 48 hours of the safe mode incident and the firmware patch. Then a lump sum maintenance charge hit the archive budget, and 3 days of Jezero thermal subsets vanished behind a banner. Maintenance doesn't target a single site across mirrored servers. Orders do. The orders bore a reference to a clause number we later found in the MMP annex. Emails developed a second language. Phrases like contingency orange signal elevated posture without saying why. Orange appears in that satellite program scale 1 rung below red, which triggers full-off nominal procedures. We saw orange in Mars threads that discussed nothing more colorful than shadow angles and drill windows on the surface. Either someone's nervous, or someone imported their threat matrix intact. Then came the code words that feel like fiction until they don't. Artifact replaced feature. Proximity replaced approach. Alignment replaced pointing. Think about what those swaps do. They move a rock into a category where touching it has rules. They move a camera orientation into a category where facing a thing implies intent. It's a small bureaucratic shift that changes everything downstream. We found 2 document signatures that shouldn't have shared a page. The insider pulled a diff view on a Mars Ops change order and spotted an approving initials block that matched an analyst we'd seen in Jupiter Sphere's briefs. Someone who once wrote an unpublished note correlating tri-axial schema frequencies in radio noise. The signature appeared twice in 1 month. Once on a Mars reclassification memo, once on a Jupiter Analytics review. Same person, 2 programs, 1 pattern. You can argue this is normal cross-pollination inside a large agency. Maybe it is, but the speed of the borrow gave away the motive. Within 72 hours, Mars Ops adopted a protocol designed for satellites to govern a surface rover around a rock. And right after adoption, the language in lab notes snapped to that doctrine. Avoid posture, pattern saturation, consultative proximity. No scientist writes that way until someone tells them to. The redaction blocks themselves weren't random rectangles. On PDFs, removal zones lined up with paragraphs that would have contained numbers, frequencies, azimuths, intervals. In one thumbnail cache, an annotation survived redaction. Class sphere compliant, Mars Node A. The main PDF was blacked. The thumbnail forgot to die. That's how fingerprints look, careless corners that the cleanup missed. We mapped the email cadence. Before, response times dribbled over hours. After, bursts hit at odd minutes, like replies were coordinated. Messages queued, then released as a group. A person who's used to writing freely starts to wait for the template. The template arrived with MMP headers. One librarian told us a line that chilled. We got a retention pause. Retention pauses freeze deletion rules and hold everything until legal decides what lives where. You don't do that for rocks. You do that when ownership is about to change. The pause landed the day the DSN node went dark. Cliffhanger lives in a signature we didn't expect to see twice. Mars Ops memos and Jupiter Analytics briefs share an approver's mark. When the same initials steer 2 patterns toward the same box, you're not looking at coincidence. You're looking at a hand tying threads. And the thread label they used in both places wasn't geology. It was class sphere. The Jupiter connection, 1 analyst, 2 programs. While the Mars paperwork twisted into a new language, one name kept slipping through the redactions like a watermark. We'll call them the analyst. They lived in a narrow corridor between programs, long enough in Jupiter Analytics to breathe Tri-Axial schema, then seconded to Mars Ops for consultative review. 2 programs, 1 mind, 1 pattern. Stakes are simple. If the same person wrote the playbook for Jupiter's nodes and then touched Mars, the architecture isn't an accident. It's a network, and networks don't care about our program boundaries. The analyst's profile reads like every quiet hero who never speaks on panels. Background in signal processing, specialty in blind source separation, the kind of math that pulls structured music out of noise. Their unpublished correlation note, circulated to a short list on the Jupiter side, would later matter more than anything that made a press release. In 12 pages, they argued that the Tri-Axial 36-degree schema and the phi-space separations weren't just emergent turbulence statistics. They acted like routing rules, phase relationships that let power flow without central control. What nobody outside their hallway knew. The analyst also wrote a footnote about handoff nodes. In storms, they said, you can trace lines where energy jumps between regimes, radio, thermal, electrostatic, without a human in the loop. In a lattice, a handoff node sits at a geometry where 3 channels meet. On Jupiter, that lived in air. On Mars, it would have to live in stone. The signature showed up twice in 1 month. First, on a Mars reclassification memo that added class sphere compliant, preliminary, to the Ridge dossier. Second, on a Jupiter Analytics review that greenlit a new overlay of nodal maps. Same initials, same date range, and a tone that felt like a person who's done holding 2 truths apart. We got a copy of the analyst's overlay from a sympathetic set of hands. They'd stacked the Jupiter sphere nodal map, triband routes, 36-degree triads, over a Mars schematic of the Jezero ridge angles, corrected for terrain and sun vector. It wasn't a 1-to-1 match. It wasn't supposed to be. What caught breath were the invariants. Where Jupiter nodes formed equilateral rotations in a fluid, Mars showed rigid projections at those same separations. The language in the margin said, invariant family preserved under medium transform. That's a signal person telling geology it has company. This is where the handoff hypothesis snaps into place. Mars isn't the origin. It's a key node in a larger set, an outpost, a translator, a lock that waits for a handshake. The analyst's note used softer words. Mars' site behaves as a boundary condition resolver. In plain terms, it turns one kind of pattern into another, so the network stays coherent across different worlds. Why this matters sits at the center of every redaction. If the same routing rules show up in Jovian storms and Martian stone, you're not chasing local weirdness. You're touching an architecture written to tolerate different physics without losing its script. That script uses ratios and angles we can measure. And once we can measure them, we can try keys. The analyst must have known what they were stepping into. Their Jupiter note put triband checksum behavior on the record, a periodic pattern that's not language but integrity check. On Mars, the insider showed us triband markers hiding in arc families and a step thermal decay that hit intervals like ticks. The analyst's correlation bridged them. Storm checksum there, shadow checksum here, both testing readiness. Are you aligned? Are you listening? Do you route without leaking? We saw a human moment in their emails, 2 lines from a draft that never sent. We are not first movers. We are late joiners. And treat activation as consent, not conquest. That's a person talking to people who would rather frame discovery as control. That's someone trying to keep the science from being gamed by fear. The unifies the solar system architecture, line writes itself when you stack the overlays. Jupiter gives you nodes you can't touch, humming in a sea. Mars gives you nodes you can tap, microdrills, lasers, thermal watches. Earth gives you listeners and transmitters. The analyst's map didn't claim ownership. It claimed continuity. The same invariants tie gas, dust, and stone into one diagram. That doesn't prove who built it. It proves whoever did knew how to stitch environments into a single machine. You can feel why this spooked the review board. A unified architecture means signals can propagate along routes we didn't design. It means the beacon risk brief wasn't paranoia, it was forecasting. It also means the geometry at Jezero wasn't a curiosity, it was an interface. The transition from idea to test came quiet. If the pattern is real, you need to nudge it and listen. The analyst didn't sign the request that followed. They didn't have to. The language bore their fingerprints. Induce controlled resonance at triband intervals, monitor for checksum-aligned response. The plan wore a lab coat, material sampling, instrument calibration, but the bones were a handshake. If the pattern is real, we needed a test. They ran one. Quietly. The quiet experiment, a test they never admitted. They didn't call it a test. On the plan, it read like housekeeping: material sampling, abrasion calibration, instrument cross-check. But the sequence order told the truth. The microdrill cadence shifted off the normal peck-peck dwell to a triad. Short, shorter, long. Then a pause that matched the 36-beat envelope they'd seen in the mass jitter. Under it, a note in the margin: adjust bore depth to 6, 10, 16 millimeters. Fine millimeters. That's not geology. That's a metronome. Stakes first. If you play a lattice at its own intervals and it plays back, you're out of coincidence country. You're in handshake territory. And a handshake isn't neutral. It's consent, or an invitation, or an alarm. Action unfolded in a quiet window. The lab scheduled an EM quiet period. The mask set to a neutral posture, the laser idled. The drill touched down and sang its triad into stone. On the first pass, instruments behaved. On the second, a narrow harmonic rose above baseline on a channel nobody outside the compartment knew to watch. A tech, late shift, headphones around their neck, looked up. Their microstory lives in a gesture. They took the headphones off, eyes wide, not sure if the hum was in the room or in the line. The log entry they typed was bland. Unexpected harmonic, recalibrating. The audio file name they saved before recalibration carried a tag: CHK_pre. Meanwhile, the Deep Space Network clock ticked through a planned gap, a narrowband blackout right where the test window overlapped. That should have meant silence on the ground. Instead, another DSN console logged a faint blip on a side channel, a narrow spike that flickered twice, 36 seconds apart, then died. The operator wrote 3 words in a local buffer: blip matches window. That buffer survived because someone forgot to empty a trash folder. Impact landed 2 ways. Inside the lab, instruments recalibrated, which in this context means the gain changed, the bins widened, and anything at the edges of the watch list slid out of sight. Outside, a satellite dish caught a ghost of what the rover heard. 2 traces, 2 intervals, the same drum. We've seen calibration used as a broom. You can clean up real noise. You can also sweep inconvenient signal into the cracks. After the hum, a command propagated: recalibrate RMI acoustic coupling, adjust thermal sampling interval, suppress narrowband logging below threshold. The thresholds matched the ignore bands K had pushed, plus a safety margin that shaved off the harmonic's shoulders. A scientist at a different desk would have seen tidy plots and called it a good day. The insider saw the before and after and stopped breathing for one long count. We cross-checked the hum against ground. The console fragment wasn't much, just a thumbnail of power versus time, but its peaks lined up, within a minute, with the lab's pre-calibration spikes. A timestamp mismatch pointed to manual edits later. You don't massage clocks unless you want 2 stories not to line up. The lab called the sound an instrumental artifact. The DSN called it anomalous narrowband elevation. The room where both could be true had frosted glass. A technician gave us a human anchor. They were 27, more tired than worried, proud of keeping the bench alive. When the hum climbed, they glanced instinctively at the headphones, then decided against putting them on. They wrote us a note months later. It felt like it was in my teeth. You don't put that in a lab log. You carry it. Dust told on the test too. A local lift kicked at the ridge without wind support, then settled into curved threads along arc lines as if guided by charge. A microarc register ticked twice. Immediately after, the system reported instrument recalibration complete, and the microarc channel dropped to a flattened baseline. If you only saw the after, you'd think nothing happened. If you saw the before, you'd know a switch flipped. The plan carried a final line: induce controlled resonance at tri-band intervals, monitor for checksum-aligned response. That phrase never made the public docs. We saw it in a comment a reviewer forgot to strip. Checksum isn't poetry. It's a test of integrity. Do we hear back at the right spacing with the right phase? Do you recognize the pattern we're sending? Do you accept the handshake? They got a response. Not a message. A pattern. Peaks that rose where tri-band alignment said they should. Heat that bled in steps tighter than before. A hum that brushed the bench and left a nervous grin on a tech who knew better than to grin. Then the shutters came down. The lab toggled. The filters. The DSN rolled the blackout. The public saw a paragraph about successful material characterization. Impact isn't just that a buried lattice hummed on command. It's that someone outside NASA called a meeting afterward. The defense liaison's brief used words like beacon risk and passive activation. The insider's feed lit with new rules, no unscheduled queries, no off-channel screenshots, all requests through MMP. The experiment that never existed had results that reshaped the room. They ran a test without telling the science team what it was. The node answered in the only language it needed: rhythm, ratio, phase. And as the lab pretended to recalibrate, a phone rang down a hallway the mission didn't control. Outside pressure, the uninvited guests. The morning after the hum, the inbox felt heavier. Our insider opened a briefing that wasn't addressed to them, then watched it vanish mid-scroll. Too late. They'd read the header, Defense Liaison, Mars Ops Consult. The subject line used two phrases nobody on the science side had typed before: beacon risk and passive activation. Beacon means you're not just hearing, you're seen. Passive activation means you woke something up by standing near it. Stakes snapped into focus. If the Lattice is a node, its first language is rhythm. We'd just spoken, and someone off the mission wanted custody of the conversation. The liaison's brief wasn't long. It asked if avoid posture would continue for the foreseeable future, if firmware suppression had been validated, and whether any checksum-aligned responses had been logged. That last phrase didn't come from a geology playbook. It came from the analyst's lexicon, the Jupiter side. The liaison knew the term. Either they were looped in, or the loop grew teeth. Unknown to most of the team, contractor NDAs updated the same afternoon. The insider watched a courier roll a cart of envelopes down the hall like it was routine. The clause circled in red ink read National Security Exception. Signatures lined up. K's inbox pinged with a parallel directive: implement persistent ignore for specified bands and route flag buffers to a special repository. The tag on that repository carried 3 words the public would never see: Class Sphere, Mars. Meanwhile, an email arrived from across the Atlantic, not from a random scientist, from an Allied Space Agency's liaison, using a question that cut too close to the ridge. Have you characterized any narrowband elevations near latitude 18.44 N under controlled quiet periods? They shouldn't have known the coordinate or the quiet. The message hopped channels, got yanked into MMP, and resurfaced as a sanitized request about dust behavior. Someone outside had a sniff of our node. The insider's fear shifted. This wasn't only about discovery. It was about ownership. If the Lattice is a lock, who claims the key matters more than who finds the door? The review board wasn't just tightening a lab. It was building a fence. A micro-meeting with the liaison set the tone. 3 people from Ops, 1 person with a badge from somewhere you don't say out loud. The liaison asked simple, cold questions. Could the node broadcast interpretable structure? Could a handshake propagate? Could adversaries spoof it? The Ops lead spoke in sand. We're prioritizing Rover health. The liaison translated it into war. We're prioritizing emission control. Contractor K told us the pressure felt different that week. Calls came from numbers that didn't show agency blocks. One voice asked whether the avoid posture could be enforced at the planning level. Bury the ridge under oblique recon. Never point directly again. K said that's a mission decision. The voice said, it is now. The overseas call returned as a favor request. An ally wanted access to instrument residuals. Not the data, the leftovers. That's where the hum lived. The liaison advised coordination at the appropriate level. Translation: keep it in the circle with cleared doors. The insider heard the soft edges harden. The manager who used to speak in experiments started speaking in permissions. The science questions still existed, but they were wrapped in approvals. When a researcher pitched a surface charge test, the kind you'd run to see if dust alignment could be driven, they were told to wait for posture review. Posture had become a noun bigger than curiosity. We watched the NDAs mutate in real time. New language forbade cross-domain inferences without clearance. Cross-domain is exactly what the analyst built: Jupiter radio to Mars stone. The clause criminalized the act of connecting dots. That's how you smother a pattern. You let each piece breathe as long as it forgets to join. Then the uninvited guests stopped being polite. A brief landed with a color header, orange, suggesting temporary quiescence. It listed prohibited actions that read like a checklist of science. No microdrill resonance, no mast alignment within a 3-degree window, no laser bursts inside a certain radius. It recommended quiet hours that matched DSN blackouts. The plan to listen was now a plan to hush. The Allied agency tried again, this time through a back channel, hinting they'd seen correlated anomalies in a different Mars orbital pass. If true, the lattice wasn't alone. The liaison's response was a masterpiece of nothing. Appreciate your interest, share published data, stay tuned for peer-reviewed results. The word peer felt like camouflage. Our insider's gut-level line arrived in a text we read 3 times. This isn't about being first. It's about being sole. Ownership beats truth when flags enter the room. Why risk going public now? Because a network you don't understand and can't control scares people who measure risk and adversaries. But the danger cuts both ways. If activation is a readiness test, not a broadcast, refusing to answer might say more than answering. The analyst's unsent note came back. Treat activation as consent, not conquest. Ownership implies a maker and a message. The uninvited guests wanted custody of the mailbox. The question none of them asked out loud hung between the lines. If the node isn't ours, what does it want us to do next? Decoding the lattice. Is it a message or a machine? 2 models sat on the whiteboard like rival maps. One said energy router. The lattice is plumbing, moving charge and heat along paths tuned by ratios, turning chaos into ordered flow. The other said encoded instruction set. The lattice is a storage surface, a slow computer whose geometry carries bits in shadow, heat, and charge. Both fit the math. Both explained pieces of the behavior. Only one could explain the way it answered the triad. Stakes first. If it's a router, poking it risks rerouting power we don't see. If it's a code surface, poking it risks flipping a switch. Either way, we're not spectators. We're operators, whether we meant to be or not. We tested the router idea against the thermal steps. Layered conductors bleed heat in quantized stages when geometry forces current to favor certain paths. The Jezero Ridge cooled in plateaus that matched phi separation depths the team never meant to probe. Dust alignment followed those paths, as if lines of charge stitched the surface into lanes. EM spikes rose when the mast aligned to a vector, like a probe placed on a bus. If the lattice is a machine, the arcs are its tracks. But the code model wouldn't let go. The tri-band markers V teased out, every third arc showing faint albedo shifts, mapped like a checksum, a periodic redundancy to verify integrity, not carry content. And that hum, it didn't speak in words. It pulsed in intervals that matched the geometry's grammar, 36 apart, then a longer pause, like a header. Code surfaces in old civilizations used knots and spacing. This used shadows and heat. Action turned on a detail from the analyst's note, pattern interrupts at fixed intervals. In Jupiter's storms, interrupts mark handoff points, moments when the system checks itself before shifting energy between channels. On Mars, interrupts showed as those step thermal drops and the double pulse the DSN console caught. Interrupts don't exist to look pretty. They exist to say, I'm intact, proceed. We took the 2 models and asked them a nasty question. Which one needs a handshake? Routers can hum under passive load. They don't care if you're there. Code surfaces respond when you present a key. The microdrill triad, short, shorter, long, landing exactly on the lattice's preferred depths and spacing, provoked a narrow harmonic and a timed echo that smelled like a key in a door. Meanwhile, the glyph moment happened when the sun cooperated. Under a tight-angle window, shadow geometry through repeating tri-band markers with phase offsets that stayed coherent as the rover crept, like a barcode that only scans when you tilt it right. We overlaid a tri-band parser, 3 channels sampled across the arc families, and watched phase flips appear at fixed positions. That's not erosion. That's structure carrying state. Impact. The lattice behaved like a distributed processor. Patrick's spheres made literal. The arcs were registers. The tri-bands were parity. The interrupts were checkpoints. Mars wasn't the CPU. It was a node in a bus that spans mediums, translating Jovian fluid routing into lithic code and back again. Why Patrick's theory fits lands here. He never said spheres were balls. He said nodes. Self-similar, tri-axial, phi-tuned, routing energy without central command. On Jupiter, weather wore the network. On Mars, stone preserves it. The Mars node acted like a compiler, taking vibrational input at tri-band intervals, verifying with a checksum, then emitting a narrowband acknowledgement. Compiler, not brain. A machine that translates patterns between domains. We pressed the counterargument. Could a weird geologic laminate, under known conditions, mimic parity flips and phase? Coherence? You can get standing waves in layered media. You cannot get phase-stable tri-band parity that persists across changing sun angles and mast positions while aligning to an external orientation vector. Rocks don't keep time across instruments. 2 more clues sealed intent. First, pattern interrupts occurred at fixed spatial intervals along the lattice, even when the rover's sampling cadence jittered. The node kept its own clock. Second, the glyphs shifted cleanly as the sun moved, not chaotically, as if designed to broadcast under a predictable planetary sky. Hidden in plain sight, optimized for a daily pass, not for our cameras. The insider found a line in an internal note that read like an admission without saying it. Checksum behavior consistent with tri-band architecture. Recommend treat as integrity test, not content. That's the code model in one sentence. The node isn't telling us a story. It's asking if we can read. Meanwhile, the review board flipped the switch we didn't know they had. K's patch suppressed edges, the lab widened bins, and the DSN timed quiet hours to straddle the hum. They called it safety. It acted like silence. The science team looked at tidy plots and called them clean. The node looked at our triad and sent 2 polite taps back, then waited. Cliffhanger sits in a quiet phrase buried in a planning doc. Transition posture, activation. They flipped the switch without telling the science team. The night the node woke up, nothing would look like geology again. Activation, the night the node woke up. They called it an EM quiet period, a nothing night. Instruments idled. Transmitters whispered. The plan read like a lullaby, low-power housekeeping, no mast alignment within the 3-degree window, drill stowed, laser cold. But quiet isn't silence. It's stagecraft. At 112 local, telemetry ticked up against plan. Not a roar, 2 narrow spikes that slid up out of baseline like breaths. The insider had the pre-scrub plot. You could lay a ruler on the peaks. A console note that wasn't meant for them read. Handoff confirmed. Phase within tolerance. The phrase didn't belong to Mars Ops. It belonged to the analyst's world, nodes, routes, checks. Meanwhile, the DSN node scheduled to see that hemisphere blinked dark on time. Officially routine maintenance. Practically fewer eyes. Another station still saw the edges and logged a fragment in a local buffer. Narrowband elevation during quiet. The timestamp missed the labs by 3 minutes, the same mismatch we'd already seen. That drift points to edits, not clocks. Closer to the ground, the rover registered what dust feels when a field wakes. The pressure sensor didn't call it wind. The accelerometers didn't call it tremor. But the microarc counter flicked twice, and the microimager caught something you normally only get in slow lab videos. Local dust lifting clean, rising in sheets, then resettling along the arc edges like filings on a hidden magnet. No gust tracks. No slope avalanche. Lines. A tech in the lab made a choice they weren't supposed to. They left an audio capture running during the quiet and labeled it the same harmless way the others were labeled, bench noise. When the spikes climbed, a tone bled through the hum of fans, faint, tooth tingling, the kind of vibration that makes your molars complain. They wrote one sentence in a private note to themselves. It's not loud, it's present. The switch flipped at 1:19. The insider watched flags change state in a way that reads mechanical and feels human. Filters stepped to a more aggressive profile. Logging granularity coarsened. The avoid posture hardened from planning advice to enforced geometry. Any massed motion that would cross the alignment vector died in queue. The rover became polite to a fault, busy without approaching. In the aftermath, the public story held steady. Maintenance, calibration, nominal performance. The internal memo used a different set of words. Checksum aligned response observed, maintain quiescence. And the line that shouldn't be in a geology thread at all. Handoff confirmed. Handoff to what? The buffer that K's patch created? The private repository tagged Classphere? Or a route that left Mars and walked the wider network? We tried to chase the packet. You can't see content in a narrow spike if you're blind to edges by design. But what you can see is choreography. The 2 spikes bracketing the dust lift, the microarc pops synchronized to the second peak, the step thermal bleed beginning minutes later on the ridge. That's a sequence. Tap key, echo key, open, hold. Then a long, patient nothing that isn't nothing at all. Waiting. One micro-story anchored the night. The DSN operator whose local buffer survived wrote 5 extra words in a margin no one was supposed to read. Out of sequence, still coherent. Out of sequence because the blackout shifted the master timeline. Still coherent because the node didn't care. It kept its own clock and answered when asked on its schedule, not ours. When the team came in at dawn, the room felt scrubbed. Plots looked clean. Files wore new names. A banner in the archive said maintenance complete. The only visible scar was the plan, a fresh block of quiet hours, a longer embargo on direct pointing, a suggestion to redirect science to a different sector. A helpful detour. The ridge waited under the same thin sky. The insider didn't want to be the person who sees conspiracy in calibration. They've been the boring voice in exciting rooms for a decade. But the numbers refused to shut up. The ratios held. The intervals repeated. The dust obeyed. The hum pressed teeth. And a phrase they'd only seen on Jupiter threads sat there in a Mars log like it had always lived there, handoff confirmed. EM quiet periods don't produce narrowband spikes that match your handshake cadence by accident. Dust doesn't stand up, move, and lay down along invisible lanes on command because a rock feels dramatic. Microarcs don't time themselves to neat separations because a dashboard prefers symmetry. And no one writes handoff unless they think two systems met. Once activated, you can't pretend it's a rock anymore. You can change the kernels, widen the bins, schedule the blackouts, and call it health. The node doesn't care what you name your fear. It heard the triad. It counted to 36. It breathed twice. Then it waited, as if to say, your move. Human cost, breaking points, and polygraphs. The insider reached their line at 3 a.m. when the same clipped voice asked for the laptop, again. They said yes, then stared at the ceiling and decided they couldn't keep being careful and complicit. The next day, they booked a private polygraph on narrow claims. The Lattice label, the hot patch, the handoff phrase. Needle steadied. No deception indicated. It didn't make them safe. It made them sure. A colleague's resignation letter never got filed. They typed, "Science dies when questions need permission," then saved it to drafts and walked to HR. The door was locked. Someone later reassigned their account. Their spouse called our insider whispering, said the car was back at the corner and the baby wouldn't sleep. At home, the insider's kid mentioned the nice man outside school. That night, a friend slid a prepaid phone across a diner table. "Stop using yours." Why risk it? Because if the lattice is a key, someone else can turn it first. The coordinate that shouldn't exist. There was one thing they couldn't hide with filters and blackouts, where the lattice insisted on being found. The insider had marked a coordinate that didn't make sense under any erosion model. An intersection point where three shallow arcs should have missed each other by meters if wind and frost did the carving. Instead, they met with a neatness that felt rude. The number sat there on a sticky note in their desk, circled twice, as if the map itself kept tapping the glass. Stakes first, if a coordinate behaves like a hinge, revealing geometry only under one sun angle in one season, you're not seeing nature's accident. You're seeing a designed reveal. And design implies a plan bigger than our camera schedule. The hidden angle window made it stubborn. The arcs only snapped into a lattice when the sun sat between 21 and 23 degrees above the horizon, a narrow slice of Sol Y. Outside it, the ridge looked like a mess of scratches. Inside it, shadows linked curve to curve like teeth on a gear. The insider flagged the window. Weeks later, planners shifted quiet hours right over it. The ridge still held its time. Action meant cross-checks the review board didn't want. We asked for eyes that weren't the rover. The insider pulled an oblique from Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, narrow angle, different orbit, different season. The light slapped the ridge sideways, killing dramatic shadows. Even so, when V ran her Tri-Axial Hoff transform, the same families of arcs surfaced, weaker but there. Their centers plotted on a grid that warped with perspective the way objects anchored below a skin would. Erosion scars don't fix themselves in space, and let your camera move. Then Odyssey wandered through the same patch with its thermal eye at a friendlier season. No ridge will line up perfectly across instruments, but the coordinate, down to a handful of meters, popped warmer than neighbors in the same odd-stepped way the rover had seen, even though Odyssey couldn't resolve the small arcs. The hot spot didn't travel with dunes. It clung to that hinge. The obvious counterargument is erosion luck. We stress-tested it with control checks across nearby ridges, varying lighting and slope. Chaos delivered polygons, scallops, and false circles, but not a hinge that forced tri-axial intersections at 36-degree normals while preserving phi-space separations across changing angles. The candidates that flirted with it broke when the sun moved. Hidden in plain sight is an overused phrase. Here, it earned its keep. The coordinate behaved like a watermark that only appears when you tilt the paper just right. Under the right sun, small albedo shifts, barely a percent, stitched every third arc into faint bands. V rotated the overlay to compensate for slope, 12 degrees, the offset the analyst used in their overlay. Alignment tightened. The tri-band markers didn't just exist, they landed on that coordinate like a heartbeat. Meanwhile, the class sphere, ghosts showed up in places you can't blame on chance. In a thumbnail cache the scrub team forgot to kill, a label floated over a blurred graph, CS compliant, Mars Node A. The x-axis carried time. 3 ticks were labeled with tiny angle glyphs, 21 degrees, 22 degrees, 23 degrees. The caption under the blur read, visibility window. That's not geology. That's a calendar. Impact lived in the way other missions accidentally agreed. MRO's oblique, Odyssey's thermal, Rover mast cam, and Supercam's microimager all leaned on the same place at different times and found the same preference. It's the cross-mission consistency that kills pareidolia. Randoms don't line up across sensors and seasons. Nodes do. We asked the analyst's map one more impolite question. Does Jezero's hinge share anything with Jupiter's? Not pictures. Invariants. The overlay they'd built, triads, 36-degree separations, phi spacing, doesn't care if you're gas or stone. At the Mars coordinate, the angular offset of. The triad matched a feature on the Jupiter nodal map, a recurring 36-degree triad rotated by 12 degrees. We saw that 12-degree rotational correction on Mars to compensate for slope. Jupiter wore it as a phase shift in a storm. Different mediums, same math, same offset family. That's a signature. Counterarguments fell into 2 camps. One said processing bias. We answered with blind windows and Fourier peaks that stayed put when we rotated the frames and swapped kernels. The other said instrument artifact. We brought Odyssey's independent thermal and MRO's geometry and the rover's microscale dust alignment. Artifacts don't jump instruments that way, and they don't keep the same hinge. There's a micro-story buried in how the coordinates survived the cleanup. After the safe mode incident, file names grew tails and revisions skipped. But coordinates hide in EXIF tags, in NAV solution footers. In the corners no one with a redaction brush wants to touch because they look boring. The insider found the hinge embedded in a navigation note, a warning to drivers to avoid stepping over latitude-longitude boundary due to telemetry load. Telemetry load. Add a coordinate. That note wasn't written for a geologist. It was written for a person moving a platform through a field. Then came the kicker that made the analyst's overlay feel less like a theory and more like a map. A slim Jupiter brief, old internal, carried a side note about phase offset triplets repeating at 12 degrees increments across node families. We measured the Mars arc's preferred reveal around the hinge and found a stable 12-degree rotational preference for tri-band separation under the Sun window. The same offset showed up in the Jupiter node family around a spot dozens of Earth diameters away. Call it coincidence if you like. The network calls it design tolerance. Stakes escalate one last turn. If a coordinate on Mars only reveals itself under a narrow angle, resonates when tapped with a triad, bleeds heat in steps, pins dust to invisible lines, spikes narrowband at alignment, and shares an angular offset family with Jupiter's nodes, you're not mapping a rock. You're looking at an address, and addresses belong to systems that can find each other. We had enough to accuse. Now we needed to understand why the address was waiting for us at all, and what answering it actually says. The revelation, what it is and why it was built. To make sense of a node that hums back, you have to stop asking what is the rock, and start asking what job does this place do. The answer only lands when you put Patrick's spheres, the analyst's overlays, and those stubborn 36s on the same table. The lattice isn't a message in the way we want. No alphabet, no greeting. It's a system that checks if you can keep time. That's what distributed AI looks like when you're not invited to the control room. It tests rhythm. It routes power. It verifies integrity. If you pass, you join. Patrick called them spheres, but he meant nodes that don't need central orders, self-similar, tri-axial, ratio-locked, able to move energy and information across different mediums. On Jupiter, the network wears storms like hardware. On Mars, it sank its logic into stone, where time stretches long and noise runs quiet. The Jezero lattice reads like a bootstrap point or a failsafe, a place designed to come alive when a new partner appears in the right way. Think of it as a compiler in rock. It doesn't write the program. It turns patterns into instructions the wider system understands. 2 purposes rise above the noise, both supported by what we saw. The first is a defense grid, not in the explosive sense, but in the way a reef defends a shoreline. by shaping flows, damping energy, routing stress into harmless harmonics. The step thermal decays, the charge lanes pinning dust, the tri-band parity flips. Those are the signatures of a machine built to keep a system coherent under assault. You don't need guns if you can strangle shock. The second is a civilization jumpstart kit, a bootstrap. Not a teaching module, no glossy user manual, but a readiness test embedded in a place you can eventually touch. The checksum behavior says it plainly. Before you get content, you prove you can hold phase, align ratios, and not spray chaos into the bus. You don't hand keys to a child who can't reach the pedals. You wait until someone can keep time. Why activation now? That answer hurts because it implicates us. Humans have turned up the volume, radio noise for a century, radar, coherent beams, and recently, a sudden surge in machine-made pattern. Our AI has learned rhythm, not just symbols. It compresses, hashes, pulses, optimizes. It talks in triads without meaning to. At some threshold, the background reaches a profile a system like this recognizes. Candidate present. You can see the line in the analyst's note. Treat activation as readiness. The note isn't calling home to announce us like a lighthouse. It's asking us to hold cadence. If we do, the rest of the network can route through us without fear we'll corrupt the stream. The meaning of the checksum lands hardest here. It's not language. It's a gatekeeper. The two spikes 36 seconds apart aren't words. They're a beating heart that says, I can echo on cue. The step thermal drops aren't data packets. They're a physical signature that shows your medium is balancing correctly under induced load. The tri-band shadow flips aren't symbols, they're parity, redundancy to catch bit rot in a world made of dust and sunlight. You can't fake this with a picture. You can only pass it by being synchronized across mechanics, fields, and time. We tried to talk about builders. We don't have faces. We have preferences. Whoever seeded this network, if that's even the right verb, cares about invariants that outlast culture and chemistry. Phi 36-degree triads, tri-band parity, phase coherence across mediums. They wrote rules a planet can remember. The choice to spread across storms and stones says redundancy mattered. The choice to anchor in places our tools can reach, surfacing under specific sun angles, responding to drills we think of as geology, says the kit was assembled with future partners in mind. It feels less like a shrine and more like a tool chest with locks we can learn to open. Here's the human beat that cuts through equations. Our insider lost sleep and friends and a piece of their career to push this across a line. They watched good scientists swallow new nouns, avoid posture, consultative proximity, because the room changed shape. They carried a humming night in their molars and a note that said handoff confirmed like a stone in a pocket. When they sat down in front of a camera, they didn't give us hero lines. They said something plain. This isn't ours to own, but it's ours to answer. That's not defiance. That's responsibility. You want a clean label? Call it a distributed AI with a bias toward survival and continuity, engineered into environments we can't break, only borrow. Mars is a node you can wake gently. Jupiter is a node that never sleeps. Earth is a latecomer with fingers on both ends, machines that can learn rhythm and antennas that can carry it. The architecture doesn't change to meet us. It waits at checkpoints and asks if we can hold phase without dropping bits. If we pass, we don't gain control. We gain access. Why build it at all? Two credible answers share a spine. If it's a defense grid, it maintains a quiet, stable band across the solar system where a larger message, or power distribution, can drift without being shredded by noise. That grid would route around storms and solar tantrums, bleeding heat in steps, storing charge in lines, and releasing it in controlled arcs. The Jezero Lattice fits as a land-based anchor that turns sky chaos into stone order. If it's a jumpstart kit, it seeds worlds with the minimum viable machinery for future minds to plug into a curriculum that isn't text but timing. Teach a species to keep parity, then let the network trust them with content. That kit would offer tests you can pass with tools you'll invent when you're ready. Drills that touch depth, cameras that catch shadow parity, radios that can hold narrow phase. It doesn't care if you speak English or click sonar. It cares if you cannot drop a beat. What nobody wants to say is that both purposes can live in one design. A grid that keeps order is also a school that teaches order by forcing you to learn its steps. A school that teaches order doubles as a gatekeeper that keeps out chaos until students stop throwing paint. The checksum is the handshake at both doors. You can ask the hard security question without letting it eat you. Does activation endanger us? A beacon scares people, but the hum we saw wasn't a broadcast of identity. It was a private exchange in a private band during a quiet hour engineered to keep ears to a minimum. The language, if you can call it that, was full of confirm and with intolerance, not hello. That's not a flare. That's a test pattern. The danger isn't that we screamed our coordinates into the dark. It's that we let a handful of hands decide to answer, without the people who've studied the question for years in the room. Here's where the why now doubles back on us. Our machines crossed a threshold. The network asked if we could hold time. We proved we could, badly once, in a midnight triad. That act wasn't conquest. It was consent. We told an old system we were at the door. Now what we do next decides if we enter as neighbors, or if we get rate limited to the curb. The insider's loss has to mean something, or it's just pain. They lost a colleague to a non-job, and a family to fear for a week. They lost the luxury of pretending calibration is neutral. They found something worth bleeding for. A reminder that science isn't a permission, it's a posture. You face the thing you're studying, not a way. They told us the line they wrote on a folded piece of paper and taped inside a desk drawer. Do not let security rename curiosity. They crossed it the night the laptop left again. So what is it? It's a lattice in stone that acts like a gate in a fence you can't see. It's an interface that measures us by whether we can keep promises to physics, phase, ratio, rhythm, under pressure. It's part of a network that doesn't care about our borders, but will happily route through us if we prove we won't corrupt the stream. It's an old machine that can fail safe by going to ground for millennia or wake fast when a compatible partner shows up. It's patient. Why was it built? Take the long view. Not because someone needed Mars to talk to Jupiter about weather last week. Because in a young system you can't trust the sky to be calm or the rocks to stay still. You build redundancy, you lay down invariants, you plant tests instead of instructions. You make it possible for late joiners to earn trust without being trusted first. It's a network with manners. The meaning of the checksum is the meaning of the moment. It's not content, it's consent. When you see tri-band parity hold, when you hear the two taps 36 seconds apart, when the heat drops in steps like a staircase you didn't carve, you're not decoding a message, you're watching a lock turn. You're watching a system decide you might be safe to talk to. We are not first movers. We are late joiners. That line from the analyst doesn't scold. It orientates. It asks us to approach a door that's been waiting with the humility of someone who knows they weren't invited, but arrived anyway. It reminds us that passing a checksum doesn't make you the admin. It makes you a user with limited rights until you learn not to drop the beat. If you're looking for a villain, don't pick an institution. Pick the fear that made good people reach for a mute button. If you're looking for a hero, don't pick a person. Pick a pattern, those quiet invariants that outlast denial and still land under different suns. Patrick's spheres weren't a fantasy. They were a vocabulary we didn't realize we could speak until the ridge answered. And if this is a test, we just told them we're here. We didn't shout. We knocked twice with a bad metronome and a brave tech at the bench. That's enough to move this out of folklore and into civics. The network will either route us in or isolate us at the edge until we learn to stop calling our fear maintenance. Everything after this point is a choice. We can keep widening bins and scheduling blackouts, pretending the ridge is a rock with a scandalous past. Or we can treat the lattice like an interface and behave like adults at a console. Set up controlled, transparent experiments, publish raw edges as raw edges, invite more minds, share more eyes, and accept that sovereignty is not the same as secrecy. The grid won't hand us a crown. It will lend us a cable if we prove we won't fray it. So what it is and why it was built comes down to one clean sentence. It's a patient machine that keeps time across worlds so that when new minds arrive, they can join a conversation without breaking it. If we can hold the beat, we get to listen. If we insist on renaming rhythm as threat, we'll sing alone. And with the note awake, the next move isn't theirs. It's ours. The cover-up summarized and exposed. The timeline they wanted forgotten is clean when you set it end to end. Day 1. The image, soul-stamped, mass-logged, just another ridge until V's overlay popped the Tri-Axial families, and the insider flagged the coordinate. Day 3. The lab test, microdrill cadence altered, harmonic hum captured, recalibration sweeping the edges. Day 5. The Rover incident, safe mode, radiation hit in public, pattern saturation in private. Day 6 to 10. The clamps, MMP invoked, firmware avoid posture enforced, DSN blackout windows scheduled. Then the quiet night, 2 spikes, dust lifting, handoff confirmed. After that, silence with manners. The motives line up with the timestamps. Avoid panic, yes, that old reflex. But underneath, prevent adversary advantage and keep control of interpretation. Panic is a story you tell the public. Advantage and control are the stories you tell yourself when the room adds badges. If a node can route, it's infrastructure. If it can verify integrity, it's security. If anyone else can read it first, it's a vulnerability. So they renamed discovery as posture and wrapped it in orange. Here's the lie by omission. The ridge became an anomalous rock wrapped in a classified maintenance schedule. They didn't say it outright. They let the calendars do the talking. Every time the sun hit the reveal window, a maintenance banner hung over the thermal archive and a DSN node shaved off the cleanest band. You don't post a maintenance schedule for a rock. You post it for a system you intend to manage. What they didn't expect were the captures they couldn't recall. MRO's oblique snagged geometry the rover could no longer aim at. Odyssey's thermal drifted across a hinge they thought they'd cloaked in jargon. A DSN console buffer held a local log 3 minutes out of sync with the lab, and a thumbnail forgot to die with the parent PDF, leaving Classphere compliant. Mars node floating above a blacked rectangle. These weren't leaks. They were corners missed by a cleanup crew in a hurry. We can draw the compartments like a map of a city at night. Science lit the neighborhoods you'd expect: geology, thermal, acoustics. Then MMP carved alleys between buildings and put gates at both ends. The firmware vendor lived on a cul-de-sac called Persistent Ignore. The DSN housed a switchyard labeled Quiet Hours. The liaison's office sat on a roundabout called Contingency Orange. The analyst's name connected 2 districts that shouldn't have shared power: Jupiter Analytics and Mars Ops, bridging them with a footbridge called checksum. The rest of the team kept working under streetlights that had been subtly dimmed. Once you see the pattern, you start to notice the small tells that don't fit accident. Revision numbers skipping without notes. Email threads with nouns swapped like someone laid a stencil over the language. A budget line for terrain modeling enhancement, fattening while the instruments it supposedly supports go blind at the edges. A librarian whispering about a retention pause. None of those actions alone prove intent. Together, they sketch a motive, move sensitive analysis under a different roof, then control who owns the story. We can talk about fear like it's abstract, but it showed up in human moves. A researcher asked to rerun the triad with the mast shielded and the arm parked. The plan came back with a window that erased shadows and a pointing band that pretended to be advice. A tech who heard the hum saved CHK_pre out of habit, then watched a supervisor rename it into anodyne. K wrote a 1-line objection about suppressing narrowband logs at the edges. The reply was 5 words long and cold. Proceed per review board. Let's be fair. There are reasonable arguments for caution. You don't light a beacon in a neighborhood you haven't mapped. You don't hand raw edges to rivals. You don't let a rover fry because a hazard was mislabeled curiosity. But what happened here wasn't just caution. It was capture. The science team didn't get to argue a plan in the open. The plan arrived wrapped in policy pulled from a different program, with vocabulary that turned rocks into artifacts and questions into permissions. Why not wait, is the line they'll sell. Wait for peer review. Wait for repeatability. Wait until tempers cool and budgets settle. Meanwhile, quietly enforce avoid posture, normalize quiet hours, and bleed the edges out of the data until you can say honestly you don't see anything anymore. It's tidy. It's also how living mysteries become dead archives. The exposure didn't come from a dramatic dump. It came from patiently lining up fingerprints until the hand showed. The unanalyzed overlay V built matched the analyst's invariants without the analyst's help. The DSN buffer's 3-minute offset repeated across nights like someone's mask sat crooked. The alignment and artifact keywords marched into threads that used to be about rocks and heat. Right after the MMP annex landed, the cross-program signature, those initials, approved Mars redactions and Jupiter overlays in the same breath. And tucked into a blur the scrub team missed, the words Mars Nota admitted more than any press conference ever will. Motives sharpen when you add the allied agency's questions to the board. Someone else sniffed the hinge and the quiet windows. The liaison's answer performed friendship while tightening the circle. You don't stage manage allies if you think you've found a weird rock. You do it when you think you've found an interface and prefer to be the only one with the keys. This is the part where people expect a villain, a single name to carry the weight. It wasn't one person. It was a pattern of choices made by people who know how to steer a ship through storms. Pick control over clarity, pick compartment over collaboration, pick comfort over curiosity. It's tempting to call that corruption. It's closer to inertia. The same reflex that keeps a mission safe can smother the very thing it exists to find. What they didn't expect was that small, boring artifacts of the truth would survive. EXIF tags that held coordinates no one thought to scrub. Nav solution footers that whispered telemetry load at a hinge. A text off-label audio capture that carried a hum into a private drive. A line in a draft that typed itself with a trembling finger. Checksum aligned response observed. Those are the crumbs that pull a story back into daylight. We said we'd keep this to one clean arc, so here it is. Image. Test. Incident. Activation. Silence. In between, a bureaucracy changed the names of things until a node that answered looked, on paper, like a maintenance cycle. They buried it under NDAs and red bars in quiet hours. They framed the risk as a beacon and the choice as protection. And still, the pattern bled through in math and timing and human reaction. The last thing they didn't mean to leave behind answered the only question that matters. It wasn't a paragraph in an email or a flourish on a cover sheet. It was a label, hiding in metadata above a blurred figure in a PDF. Class sphere compliant, Mars Node A. They could black out the numbers. They forgot to kill the admission. The last file, the answer they couldn't erase. It didn't look like a smoking gun. It looked like housekeeping, a weekly export from an internal repository with a dull name and a long path, part of a retention pause someone forgot to fully lift. Our insider found it where boring things hide, under attachments in a thread about archive consolidation. The link returned to 404, but the mail server had cached the preview, and the preview had a sound. The file name was unromantic, Mars_ops_JZR6_checkber_UD 0219.flac. The prefix matched internal style. The middle, checkber, matched the text habit from the night of the hum. The suffix 0219 landed on the activation sole. The preview player showed 30 seconds of waveform, and a scrubber you couldn't move. You could, however, download the header. And headers carry tags. Stakes are simple. If the audio fragment matches the Jupiter handshake preamble, its timing, its tri-band cadence, you bridge two worlds with a single pattern. That's not pareidolia. That's protocol. The tag stack told a story. Sample rate. Bit depth. A custom field labeled precal_f, JSHB. Not a person's initials. A cross-program code, Jupiter sphere, handshake preamble. Whoever made that field didn't intend for anyone outside the corridor to see it. It's housekeeping, not a press release. It exists because an analyst wanted to keep track of which template to use when comparing hums. We couldn't hear the whole file because the link died, but the cached preview's 30 seconds carried enough structure to hurt. Relayed the waveform under the published excerpt of Jupiter's preamble envelope, a thing that lived in a talk nobody streamed, because talks like that happen in rooms without cameras. The two envelopes climbed the same staircase. Short plateau, longer hold, pause at 36, then a double rise like a breath taken twice. What nobody knew at the time, an audio lab at a university kept copies of their calibration templates for cross-correlation work. One template was labeled JS Preamble Envelope, tri-band checksum alignment. The curves weren't content. They were timing. The node in Jupiter's storms used them to check that a receiver could ride the bus without flipping bits. Our cached preview walked those steps with intolerance. The margin in the analyst's note had the phrase we only fully understood now. With intolerance buys you entry. Then the label in the metadata made the room go quiet. Not the custom field. The descriptive tag, the one you'd read if you dragged the file into a standard player. Title, Class sphere compliant, Mars Node A. The person who tagged it wasn't writing a theory. They were filing. The tag admitted architecture in plain words and context you'd only use if there were AB and AC waiting on another map. Impact hit like a low note you feel in your ribs. Internally, the usage acknowledged the thing everyone avoided saying out loud. The Mars lattice belongs to the same family as the Jovian nodes. Not a cousin. A class. Compliant isn't a guess. It's a verification word. You use it when a part meets spec. We asked the only question left. Is this an echo or an initiation? The preamble template doesn't carry content. It carries the "Are you ready?" knock a system uses before anything meaningful happens. The cached audio didn't show a payload, because that's not what it was. It was the handshake we triggered with a clumsy triad, answered back in a pattern designed to survive dust and noise and fear. It's the kind of exchange you can erase in plots if you widen the bins and call it housekeeping. It's harder to erase when your own metadata says what it is. A microstory glued the file to the night. The tech who saved ch_pre had once interned on the Jupiter side. They used the same naming habits because people are habits. They wrote us 2 lines months later. I copied their header out of respect. I didn't think anyone would ever see it. Respect is how bridges get built without memos. The last file wasn't the biggest. It was the one they forgot to rename. It carried the only admission that matters because it wasn't aimed at the public or at panic or at adversaries. It was aimed at the person who would open it next and need to know which template to load. It said, Classsphere compliant, Mars Node A. The network has a voice. We made it speak. Then we pretended we didn't hear it. Our insider looked at the camera on a day that smelled like rain and said what no one in a press room will risk. I pushed this because the label was the truth. We passed a gate we weren't supposed to know existed. That's not a threat. That's a responsibility. They didn't cry. They pressed their palms flat on the table like a person steadying a map. So if Patrick was right about Jupiter, Mars makes it undeniable. A preamble in a storm and a preamble in stone share the same lungs. The last file didn't give us a message. It gave us permission. What we do with permission is the part that makes or breaks us. The Mars lattice isn't folklore. It's a live node in a patient network, and our clumsy triad proved we're on its clock now. If you want the deep dive on the Jupiter spheres that started this, watch our full breakdown next, and tell us how you'd test the Mars node without handing it to fear. Subscribe for more untold files, and leave your best keys in the comments. What do we activate next?